Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam baraka ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. قال الإمام العلامة أبو الإخلاص حسن ابن عمار الشرنبلالي رحمه الله تعالى في كتابه نور الإيضاح ونجاة الأرواح باب شروط الصلاة وأركانها, the chapter on the conditions of the prayer, the prerequisites of the prayer and its pillars. So like I said, we're not going to read the Arabic, we're just going to read the English. This class is in English, by the way, to just make a note of that. It's in English, the class. But we will have Brother Hassan read and I'll comment and we'll talk about the various topics and rulings that arise. So Hassan, you're going to be now live and speaking, so please, over to you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum everybody. Sheikh, just a quick one. I think the difference between the PDF that is put up on the book, if anybody's got the book,
Yep.
we're on page 141 if you've got the book. I don't know
so if
what
you've got the book like myself and Hassan, you're correct. I'm on page 141, which is a slightly different page on the PDF. Thank you for that.
Okay. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Conditions of the prayer and its pillars. That which is required for the validity of prayer. In order for the prayer to be valid, 27 conditions must be satisfied. Purification from the state of minor and major impurity. In addition, purity of one's body, clothes, and place of prayer from filth which is not excusable. And the area where the feet, hands, knees, and forehead are placed for prayer must also be pure. This is the most correct opinion.
And this is the most correct opinion. Jazakallah khair. So, just another point. We will only be going over this book we have is actually with notes and Maraqi al-Falah as well. We're not going to go over the notes. We're going to just go over what's emboldened, which is the Nur al Idaah, which is the Arabic. So the Arabic has a translation in bold. That bold writing is what we're going to be going through as well. What Hassan just read. So thank you to him for reading. Jazakumullah khair. And what he read was the prerequisites, the conditions required for a prayer to be valid, and the major ones which were previously mentioned in this book. So the whole chapter of purification dealt with the concept of, as it says there, from purification of the state of minor and major impurity, purity from hadath, which is any form of impurity. So you need to make sure you're in a state of wudu, and the rulings of wudu are not something we're going to study. Similarly, one needs to make sure that the place you're praying upon and the clothes you're wearing during your prayer are pure as well. So we do hope to release, inshallah, all being well, a series of lectures on purification from this very book on Nur al Idaah. It's going to be a pre-recorded course, not a live course. So that's why we've jumped here to the prayer itself. So inshallah, all being well, we are working on this fiqh of purification. So don't think that we just jump to the prayer and we're going to ignore purification. That's something we're working on in the background, which is already, in motion. So we can't join in the middle of it. So we're finishing that off, hopefully releasing that for your benefit, inshallah ta'ala. So you need to purify your clothes, you need to purify the place, make sure it's clean, from filth which is not excusable. Again, what is excusable, what is not excusable, the ma'fu anhu, the size of a dirham, the quarter of a garment, that kind of, those rulings have preceded, and inshallah, like I said, we will release that information for you. And says this is the most correct opinion. So the place where you prostrate and so forth has to be pure as well and clean. So the first condition is purity in those different ways. So purity of your body or your spiritual being, which is the wudu, purity of your physical body and clothing, and of course purity of the place of prayer where you're going to be praying, all require purity. So moving back to you, Hassan.
Okay. Clothing one's nakedness, and it is of no harm if one's nakedness can be seen from the opening of the neck of one's clothes or from below.
Yeah, so now we have to wear pure clothes. We have to wear enough clothes to cover the awrah, the word there for nakedness, or which I like to call the reserved area. It's a bit more euphemistic approach, a bit more adab and etiquette in saying the reserved area. Is different for men and women, and it's something we should really talk about now. And there's one important point in this as well, which is not often mentioned for ladies. But first of all, for men, it's from the navel to the knee. That doesn't mean you just got to cover that in prayer. It's a case of that's the minimum required. So from the navel to above the navel slightly and below the knee slightly, of course, but that's the absolute minimum. Meaning, if I only got one piece of cloth and I have to pray, what do? You wrap yourself in a way that covers the aura. Of course, in normal circumstances, you'd have a long shirt on or trousers and a shirt and, and enough to cover your body and more. So for men, it's that. For women, it's everything apart from the hands and the face. So the hair, the ears are included, the neck, the whole of the body, apart from the face and the hands. And the one thing that is sometimes left out and is confused, or it's a difference of opinion actually, is the feet of a lady. Are the feet required to be covered, or are the feet not required to be covered? Is always a question that comes up at this stage. And the safer approach, and the one that I learned in Syria and is practiced as a more sort of cautious approach, is for ladies. So from my family members, they cover their feet whilst praying. No, it's not aura outside the prayer. Some have said as well that covering the feet for ladies is also outside the prayer required, but majority have not said that. It's a case of some opinions. But in the prayer, to be safe, you basically wear a pair of socks. It's much safer to have that approach for ladies whilst praying. It doesn't mean if you don't follow that opinion, if all your life you've been praying without socks on and sometimes barefoot for ladies, your prayers are invalid, or you need to change. Alhamdulillah, the prayers are prayers, and you study what you studied in the books. Often it doesn't mention the feet need to be covered for ladies, which is the case. That is a valid opinion that's practiced more so in the subcontinent and such countries. They don't have the ruling of you got to cover the feet as well. It is something that is mentioned in some books of the Hanafi school and other schools. Of course, Imam Shafi and others, they held the opinion that you have to cover the feet as well. So it's just a safer option when it comes to covering the private area, the reserved area of an individual, to take the safest approach. Another point to mention before we move on to the Qibla is what we've just mentioned are the rulings for the aura or the reserved area based on salah. We're not talking about the general rules of aura. If you're with a family member, with spouses, with father, mother, mothers-in-law, and all that kind of situation is not the topic of this. This is just for salah. Often people take this and say, this is the ruling in general. So we don't want to have that misunderstanding. What we talked about here right now, for men, is from the navel to the knee, is for salah. For women, it's everything upon the hands and the face. And of course, the feet are differed over. And we said it's better to cover the feet. It's safer. But, if you don't do that, it's not the end of the world. But it definitely is important to be more cautious. That's just for salah, okay? That's not outside of salah. That's not in your home. That's not in public. That's the whole. It's not with ladies only. It's not, what's the etiquette and so forth. There's lots of rulings regarding clothing and covering oneself. That is not the topic of today. It's just for salah. We need to understand that this is the minimum that needs to be covered. And one final point on that is it mentions there that there's no harm in seeing the aura from an opening in the clothes from the top or the bottom. What does that mean? It means when you put your clothes on, if it's unlikely, but if somebody was to look underneath, they could maybe see, if you don't have any undergarments on, they could see your aura. Sometimes you can see from the neck of your garment. If you look down, you can see your actual aura yourself, right? That doesn't harm the fact that you're covered yourself. So somebody's looking from top down doesn't affect anything. It doesn't mean your aura is not covered if you can see from a little opening here, which you maybe well could, part of your aura below. That doesn't affect the fact that your aura is covered. Your aura is covered as long as it can't be seen from a normal angle, from extreme top and extreme bottom is not considered an issue. So what that means is, really, you should have undergarments on. But if you didn't have any undergarments on, you had put one garment on, a jubba or a long gown or something that covered everything, and you had everything else covered as well, and you prayed like that, is valid. The scholars have discussed in the books of fiqh, is it valid to pray in one garment, or must you put undergarments on and cover underneath? That is something mentioned, and the ruling is mentioned there that there's no harm In other words, it's not invalid. It's better to cover more so, but it's not invalid if you were to just wear one garment and through it, the top, not through it, but through the top of it, the opening at the top or the bottom, the aura would be visible or could be visible. That wouldn't affect the validity of the prayer. But that's clear. So covering the aura is for the prayer mentioned here, just for the prayer, and it needs to be done properly. And one final point actually on that is that it can't be see-through, it can't be translucent, it can't be that if you were to put your here, just here, if you were to put there and you can see your skin through this garment, which you can't, so this is good enough, right? If you can see the skin through here, that's not valid to use or to cover yourself for salah. Obviously the arm is an aura for a man, so it's not a harm, but for the ladies, if your sleeves are see-through or translucent or not thick material, or that is therefore invalid because you haven't technically covered yourself. Even for men, if they haven't covered the area with a strong, clear, cotton, opaque material, then it's invalid if you can make out the skin underneath. So where's the borderline? If you can make out the skin underneath, it's not covered, right? And that differs from material to material. So just be safe and have something quite, blocked out, opaque, that covers your skin. And there is another ruling to mention, although it's not invalidating of salah, it is something we should be aware of, and it goes more to the rulings of aura in general, of reserved area, and that is that if the shape is showing of the body, wherever you've covered your aura that needs to be covered, it's not going to invalidate the prayer, so it's not really, unless it's not mentioned here, but of course that is not good. That is something which should be avoided as well, and we shouldn't, men and women shouldn't wear tight clothing that exposes their bodily shape, whatever part of the body it is, especially the more central areas. Both men and women should be aware of wearing loose clothing. So Islamic clothing isn't necessarily a particular design or a particular color or culture. Islamic clothing is modesty or modest and loose, and whatever culture that's from, whatever color it has, etc., is fine. So you'll find different, styles across the Muslim world. But as long as it fulfills that criteria of modesty, loose, covering, not showing through, that is what's required, insha'Allah ta'ala. So now we move on to the next one. Over to Hassan again.
It's a condition to face the direction of prayer, the Qibla. Accordingly, the one living in Makkah who can see the Kaaba is required to face it directly, whereas the one who cannot see the Kaaba must face its direction, even when he is in Makkah. And this is the most correct view.
Thank you, Hassan. So Qibla is the next. So purity was first, various cases of purity, clothing covering one's reserved area. Number 3, to face the Qibla. The Qibla, the word actually Qibla means direction itself. And the Qibla that we face, our Qibla, our direction which we face during prayer, is Makkah al-Mukarramah, and specifically the Kaaba. The Kaaba al-Musharrafah. May Allah allow us to make Hajj and Umrah and open the doors for the Muslims around the world and relieve everyone of this difficulty. And most of all, give us sabr, patience, and perseverance and optimism to get through these times. But we hope to go there one day again. And if you haven't been there for the first time, if you've been there for the second and more, inshallah ta'ala. So facing the Kaaba is the actual requirement. So if you're in Makkah and if you can see the Kaaba, so you're in the masjid really, or you're in a hotel and you can see it and you're praying from your hotel, which is not good, but if you are, then you must make sure you are facing the exact Kaaba, meaning your line of your body line, which is from the chest, and obviously the head as well, but the chest more so. So it's about the chest, because you could turn and pray like this. So you're not facing that way in prayer, you're facing where your chest is facing, okay? That's the important thing to remember here. So going like this in prayer is not turning away from the Qibla or breaking your prayer. So facing the Qibla needs to be directly to the Kaaba with your chest, if you are in Masjid al-Haram, in the Kaaba or around it, or in the direction of it if you can't see it. So if you're in Makkah somewhere else or wherever in the world, then the direction of the Kaaba, which differs from wherever you are, the compass direction will differ. If you're in the east, which is Pakistan, for instance, then you'll face west. If you're here, you're in the northwest for the UK, then you face southeast-ish. The exact coordinates and so forth are mentioned, but you have to face the direction of the Kaaba. Now, you don't have to face the exact direction of the Kaaba, meaning it has to be certain that you're facing the Kaaba directly. You have a leeway, okay? And it says here, if I repeat what it says, whereas the one who cannot see the Kaaba must face its direction, even if he is in Mecca, and this is the most correct view, meaning even if you're in Mecca and you don't directly face the Kaaba, if you can't see it, so you might actually be facing 10 degrees away from the Kaaba, that's still valid, okay? If you can't see the Kaaba, as long as you're in the rough direction of the Kaaba, what is that rough direction? That rough direction is 45 degrees on either side, right? So there's a diagram in the book there, but if we, can I get this? I can't see it. Oh, here it is. No, I won't do it. But if you think of it as a 45 degrees, so you're facing the Kaaba, this is where you're facing, you have this area here of 45 degrees where you can be facing either side of the Kaaba by 45. So it's 90 degrees altogether, it's a right angle, right? But it's 45 degrees on either side of the Kaaba from wherever you are. So from the UK, from Europe, wherever, South Africa, that's your leeway. So if you're outside of the area, then you're not actually facing the Kaaba, and your prayer would not be valid, okay? There are rules of what if you don't know where the Qibla is and so forth. They're coming later, so don't worry about the more detailed rules of the Qibla. I don't know, I'm not sure. That will be discussed in time to come. But for now, we'll move on to the next point, if Hassan can read that one.
The arrival of prayer time, and the one must be certain that the time has arrived.
Jazakallah khair. So prayer time, the prayer is, they say, awqatuha asbabuha. The prayer times are the reason, the cause of you having to pray the prayer. So when the prayer time enters, so Zohar here in the UK would enter in about 45 minutes or so, that's when you have to pray the prayer, and that's when you can only pray the prayer as a valid prayer, or as a on time prayer. If you miss the prayer time, then you will have to make that up, which is called qada, and if there's no valid reason for that, then it's sinful. But you can't pray a prayer before its time. So praying in the time is a requirement for the initial obligatory nature of the prayer. So it's not obligatory on you to pray, or it's not valid on you to pray Zohar right now. I'm going to pray my Zohar, and then, you're not going to go anywhere right now, but I'm going to go spend time with the family or in the back garden. You can't do that. You can't pray Zohar now. You have to pray Zohar after the time of entry, which again, prayer times are something that were discussed previously, and they're not in this section. But for Zohar is when the zenith occurs of the sun, and then there's the decline of the zawal is after the zenith. The zenith is the high point of the sun, and as it starts to decline and set towards the west, then you can start praying Zohar, and that's the time of Zohar, all the way until Asr time, for instance. And you need to be certain of that, so you need to make sure the time has entered, not guess, or I think it's entered, and let me pray, I think I can pray. No, I'm sure it's time for the prayer, I'm going to pray now. And that's a prerequisite of the prayer. So moving on to the next one.
To form an intention.
Yep. So simple, straightforward. You have to intend. All ibadat, all acts of worship require an intention. Whether you're fasting, giving your zakat, performing hajj, praying, salah, it requires you have an intention. And again, further details of the intention will be coming shortly. Next one.
To say the opening Allahu Akbar without separating it from one's intention.
Yep. So the next prerequisite, and some say it's part of the prayer. So this one's, is it a prerequisite or is it part of the prayer? What's the difference, you might ask? The prerequisite is something that happens outside of the prayer. So your wudu can be done before, and it can be done at any time. Your wudu is outside of the prayer; it can be done any time. You can face the qibla before you even start praying. You can cover yourself. You can, the prayer time is not in the prayer. Right? You're not praying the prayer time. These are all things which are prerequisites, which mean they can be achieved and fulfilled without the prayer actually being or starting or being like the prayer being saying, this is part of the prayer. So with the Allahu Akbar, so even the intention can be made before you start, and it is before you start the prayer. So these are all things that can be done before the prayer. They do need to be maintained. So you've got to keep your clothes covered. You've got to keep in purification. You've got to stay facing the Qibla during the prayer as well. So the part of validity of the duration of prayer as well. But what about the Allahu Akbar? Where does that come in? Is it before the prayer, or is it actually the beginning of the prayer? Scholars differ over this very technical thing. We don't need to really know that it's actually said to be from the prerequisites. But as you can see, because we're discussing it right here, it's kind of considered to be a prerequisite of salah. So saying Allahu Akbar is before your salah to start your salah. And your salah, your prayer, your namaz, your salah actually starts with Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika, or as we call it, athana, which is glorification of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the takbir is to put you into the state of salah. It's not the salah itself, it's what transitions you from. It's called the tahrima. So in the Arabic, if you can follow that, it says what tahrima. Tahrima means from haram. It means prohibited or sacred. It puts you in a sacred state. So when you say Allahu Akbar, you're in a different state now. Rules have changed. Just like in fact ihram. Ihram and tahrim are very similar in meaning. They both come from the word haram, which although is commonly translated as prohibited or not allowed, it actually means sacred, something which is in a very sacred state. So ihram, you're in a sacred state of ihram where you can't trim your hairs, or wear, for men they can't wear a stitched garment and so forth. You can't kill insects and these kind of things. You're in a sacred state when you're in ihram. When you're in the haram, all from the same root, haram. There's certain rules that you're not allowed to violate. For instance, you can't go into the haram of any place, or especially Mecca and Medina, when you're in a state of major ritual impurity, and you can't do certain things in the haram as well. There's certain rules, hence why they're called sacred lands. So sacred is a better translation of this word. So the tahrima for salah puts us in this sacred state. So we're no longer allowed to talk to people. Think about, you're not allowed to eat or drink. You're not allowed to, speak to, say something or direct someone. You have to be focused on one thing, which is the salah. That takbirah, that Allahu Akbar, which is called the tahrima, which makes you into this sacred state, must be coupled with or come soon after, not instantly, but very much soon after the intention. Instantly is better. I intend to pray 4 rakats for Salat al-Dhuhr behind the Imam, if you're behind the Imam, or Salat al-Dhuhr, Allahu Akbar. So your intention, and you have to say the intention, by the way. Intention is in the heart, but if you do pronounce it, which we're going to talk about, then that's fine. But make sure it's in the heart. And then you say Allahu Akbar, it's attached to the intention. If you were to make your intention, say I pray, I'm intending to pray 4 rakats for Salat al-Dhuhr, then you paused for a moment, and then you went Allahu Akbar, that's fine as well. So a pause just to gather your thoughts and so forth. It doesn't take away or negate and rule out the fact that you were you had an intention for the prayer, and now that intention is invalidated. So that pause or slight delay is not problematic at all. It's perfectly fine. You can do that. So then we can move on to the next one, Hassan.
One must utter the opening Allahu Akbar while standing before bending over for the ruku'.
Yeah, so the condition for the takbirah, so this is now talking about the Allahu Akbar, is that it's got to be done in a standing position. You can't say Allahu Akbar whilst in ruku', right? You can't say Allahu Akbar whilst in ruku'. So if I ask you all to use that chat feature now, because somebody tell me when a person is classified as being in ruku'. So if you've located the chat thing on the right hand side, then please enter an answer. I'm leaving it to you guys for a moment. When is somebody classified as being in ruku'? Bending is part of ruku'. It's not what. So the question is, at what position? So if you're bending, at what position would you be classified in ruku'? Because if you're in ruku', you can't do Allahu Akbar. You can't start your prayer in ruku'. So at what point would you not be in ruku' if you were, like, let's say you had your so some people start their prayer, they got their head bowed down, right? They say Allahu Akbar. Is that right or wrong? So when would we be considered to be in ruku', and when would we not be considered to be in ruku'? What's the decisive point, the break-off point for ruku'? shy bunch of people, mashallah, don't want to answer. Bending of the back, if the hands can touch his knees. Thank you to Bilal, mashallah, thank you very much. That's the correct answer. If his or her hands can touch the knees, so if you're bowed down in such a way that if you were to stretch out your arms, right, and your arms would touch the fingers of your arms, of your hands, sorry, would touch the kneecap, any part of the kneecap, you're in ruku. Technically, that's the beginning of ruku. That's not the ruku you need to do in the prayer, but that is a ruku. If you're at that position, you're bent over so much, and you say Allahu Akbar at that position, it's not valid. Okay, that's what we're trying to explain here. It's not valid to start the prayer in ruku. When are you in ruku? How on earth can you start the prayer in ruku? Of course, we don't start prayer in ruku. We start prayer standing up. Exactly. Standing up is here. Even with your head bowed is fine, because with your head bowed, your arms won't reach your knees normally if you stand. They'll only reach the knees, your hands, when you lean forward, which is what you were saying when you bend the back. But when you lean forward enough for your hands to reach the knees, you are actually in ruku. So please remember that. It's an important aspect, especially if you're a brother who's rushing to the masjid, which won't happen anytime soon. But if you were, and you're joining the prayer, and the imam and the congregation are in ruku, they're already bowing. So what some individuals do, they go Allahu Akbar, and they join, and they join into the prayer in ruku. When did you say Allahu Akbar? If you said Allahu Akbar standing, and then you went into ruku, that's fine, because the Allahu Akbar has to be standing, as it says here, before you bend over for ruku. But if you said Allahu Akbar and you're actually in ruku, or your hands can touch your knees, which is the minimum, then you haven't said Allahu Akbar or the first takbir correctly, and you haven't actually started your prayer, because you need to say that to start the prayer. So you're going to pray with the imam, you're going to pray in the congregation, and you actually haven't even started or commenced your prayer correctly. You're going to go home thinking you've prayed and you haven't prayed. It's very dangerous not to learn the rules of prayer and the takbir. You can't pray you can't start your prayer whilst in a bent forward position, unless that's a medical condition. So some people have got bad back, so they have to lean forward constantly. They've got hunchback kind of thing, and the hands are always going to be at their knees. If that's the medical condition, that's fine. We're not talking here about people with medical conditions or difficulties. We're talking about the normal state of affairs. In such a case, that would be forgiven, medical conditions, right? So Bismillah, moving on to the next one, Hassan.
One must not delay the intention from the opening Allahu Akbar.
Yeah.
Did we just cover that bit? I think in the first.
So what that means is you can't make it after. So in the Arabic it says Adam ta'khiri niyati yani tahrima, yani you can't say Allahu Akbar and then make the niyyah afterwards. That's what it's trying to say. No, it's not trying to say do the Allahu Akbar after the niyyah. It's actually saying don't do the intention after Allahu Akbar. Right? So you have to make the intention first, and then the Allahu Akbar second. Okay, I hope that makes sense. It is a repetition of that first point, but just reworded basically. The first point was saying don't leave a gap. So don't say intention and then half an hour later I'm going to start my prayer. Don't leave a gap, basically a big gap, 5-10 minutes. This one's saying don't delay the intention till after the tahrima. Make the intention straight away. It is a slightly different point, but similar as well. Hope it makes sense. But yes, move on to the next one.
Yeah. One must utter the opening Allahu Akbar to the degree that he can hear himself according to the correct view.
Yeah, so this is an important point, not just for the takbir at the beginning. It's also important for the whole of the prayer if you're reciting anything, and that is you have to say every word of the prayer that you're saying, Subhanakallahumma, Alhamdulillah, La ilaha illallah, or At-tahiyatullah wa salawatu, in an audible fashion. Lip movement is not recitation. Okay, whatever is recited in the prayer. So if you're in a congregation, you won't read the Quran, but if you're praying by yourself, you will read Surah Al-Fatiha and Surah in addition to Al-Fatiha. In those circumstances, you have to, in those circumstances, you have to make sure what you say is audible. And that means, as it says there, you must utter the opening Allahu Akbar to the degree that he can or she can hear himself, and not lip movement. And that applies to all recitation in prayer. I'll make that point again. Whenever you recite anything in the prayer, the takbir at the beginning, or the salam at the end, or at-tahiyat, or al-fatiha, it must be read to such a level where it would be audible to you at least. So if you're somebody who's right next to you, can they hear you say something? Is there a sound? There's minimal sound, but there is sound. So what we say is you recite quietly, not silently. Silently is, almost implies there's no sound, although you could use silently to mean quietly as well. But what we mean here is that there's very minimal sound. That's the minimum requirement for your takbirah, Allahu Akbar, and for all parts of your prayer. Hope that makes sense. Okay, next point, Hassan.
The follower must intend being linked with his imam.
Right, exactly. So if you're in a congregation, then you have to intend for the to follow the imam. So you can't just say Allahu Akbar and I'm, what are you doing? So you have to, it's a basic intention, but it has to be done for the follower to have a correct following of the imam. It's not the other way around. So somebody say, well, I didn't intend to follow the imam, but he intended to lead me. No, it doesn't work that way. You have to intend to follow the imam to be a follower, okay? It's simple, straightforward, but it has to be part of your intention. So when you say, I intend to pray 4 rakat, fard of Salat al-Dhuhr, and I'm following the imam, behind the imam, with the imam, Allahu Akbar, that's fine. Right? If you join late, same thing. You make the intention that you're following for your following to be valid. The imam may intend to have people behind him and be the imam of the people behind him. That doesn't mean your prayer is automatically with the imam. You have to make the intention to attach your prayer to the imam. And there's more detail coming up on the chapter of congregational prayer, inshallah. But we'll move on to the next point, Hassan.
One must specify the obligatory prayer being offered.
Yeah, so that means you don't just say, I'm praying fard, 4 rakat, fard, Allahu Akbar. I'm praying, even if you say 3 rakat, fard, Allahu Akbar, what 3 rakat fard is? We know it's Maghrib, but you have to make sure it's in your intention. By the way, I'm going to repeat again, you don't have to say this, you have to know it in your heart. On one occasion, I actually prayed Asr with the intention of I didn't pray Asr with the intention of Zohar. I prayed Asr with the intention of Asr. I prayed, it's actually previous point. I prayed the prayer. It doesn't make a difference, but I'll tell you anyway now. We joined the prayer. We joined at the end. So I think I missed a rakat, joined late. And there was a new imam of the masjid. This is in Sheffield, where I'm from. So the first time the imam's ever there. And obviously in my head, I always thought that I'm praying behind the other imam, the normal imam. And I was a bit confused because the sound was different. And I didn't think it's a new imam or different imam. It looked like the same person from behind. So after we prayed, I was like, hey, I didn't intend to pray behind this person. I intended to pray behind the other one. I actually thought that in myself. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you intended this imam or that imam. You intended the imam that was in front of you, that's fine. Right? So if you get confused with who the exact imam is, as long as you intend to follow the imam, that's fine. And that's what you say usually, behind the imam, the person leading this prayer, Allahu Akbar. You don't need to mention his name or exactly who he is. But that happened to me actually, and I remember that time because I was really worried, like, is my prayer valid? Am I right? Is that right or wrong? And then we learned afterwards, it doesn't really matter who the imam is, as long as you intended to follow the imam. As for this point, obviously, you have to specify that you're praying fard and which fard it is. So you can't say, I'm praying 4 rakat fard of Zuhr or Asr or something like that, and you're actually praying Isha. You have to mention Isha and the fard for that to be valid. So it's an important point to mention that you're praying fard prayer and it's of such and such a prayer time, etc. Inshallah ta'ala. The next one over the page.
One must specifically intend which wajib prayer he is praying.
Yeah, so same concept. If you're praying wajib, so the wajib prayers are Eid prayer, the daily prayer, that's wajib, is the witr prayer. Then you would intend to, this is a wajib of Eid prayer, this is the wajib witr I'm praying. You gotta know. So intention is knowing, basically. You gotta know it's a wajib prayer. As long as you know that and you have that intention, that's fine. Next one.
It is not a condition to specify the intention for voluntary prayer.
Exactly. So when it comes to nafal or voluntary prayer, if you just said, I'm praying 2 rakats, Allahu Akbar, that's fine. You don't have to say it's nafal, you don't have to say at this time, that time. I'm just praying 2 rakat, I'm praying nafal for Allah, Allahu Akbar. I'm just praying for Allah. just the intention of prayer. So this is the ruling. Anytime you intend prayer, it counts as nafil. It just counts as the minimum. You get the minimum, which is nafil. If you want your prayer to count for fard, or the next level is wajib and fard, then you have to make the intention that this prayer is for fard or this prayer is for wajib. If you don't intend that, you get nafil prayer basically. So Allahu Akbar 4 rakats. What is it? Is 4 rakats nafil. There's no requirement of an intention to specify nafil, because prayer itself is nafil. Prayer itself is, prayer itself is an act that you choose to do. So unless you choose to fulfill your obligation, which requires a specific intention, you'll get the reward of, and you'll get the act of a nafil prayer without ever having to make the intention of nafil. No, it's not something that's probably practically done, but that's the rulings. If you don't have an intention of what degree of prayer is, sunnah, fard, wajib, it counts as the basic level of nafil. Next point, Hassan.
Just a quick one, Sheikh. Just on this one, it does say an additional, even if it's a sunnah of the dawn prayer. So with regards to sunnahs, is it just specifically you don't need to make intention for this one?
Yeah, good question. Very good question, and thank you for pointing that out. So when we categorize prayers, I am going to do this. Sorry, guys, I'm going to move the camera a bit. I'm going to just change things over a little bit because I want access to the... Right, it's gone wonky now. Oops. There we go. Right, brilliant. Now I can show you, okay. Let's go to this whiteboard. Okay. So now you should all see a whiteboard in front of you. So we have here Salah. Salah is of two categories, okay. One is nafil, which is supererogatory, the fancy word for it, extra prayers, optional prayers. And the other one is non-nafil, which would come under fard. Oh, actually, I won't use fard, that'll confuse you. We'll use here necessary prayer. It's necessary. Okay. Now, under the nafil prayer, whenever we say nafil, we actually mean two things. We mean sunnah, right? Any sunnah as well. And we mean anything else, or nafil as well. So it's weird to say nafil under nafil, but it also counts as a nafil prayer. So any sunnah is actually recorded as nafil in ruling. The name isn't nafil, so we don't call our sunnah prayers nafil prayers. But the ruling of them is the same as all other nafil prayers. Okay? With necessary, you've got two categories, but one is basically fard and one is wajib. And technically, they both come under what we classify as fard. Why fard? Fard in Arabic means it must be done. It must be carried out physically. Okay? So both the fard and wajib prayers are a must to be carried out physically, and not doing so is not allowed. The difference between them is the level of incumbency. With the fard, it's a major sin to not do that without a reason. And for the wajib, it's not a major sin to do that without a reason. It's a lesser sin, right? It's a makruh tahrim, which is close to haram, close to being a really bad act. So it's just a level of necessity there. But they're both necessary. One's classified as fard. They even sometimes call this wajib fard. They do call it fard, but they add a word to it, fard amali. Like fard by action, not fard by belief. So this one is also fard amali, but also i'tiqadi, meaning if you deny this fard, if you deny any of the five prayers, that's disbelief. Right? It's not allowed. It's completely breaks the foundations of our faith. So that's why zakat is fard. You can't deny it either. Other forms of required charity are wajib, such as sadaqat al-fitr, such as kafaratul yameen, etc. These are wajib sadaqat, etc. So coming back to this point now, it says, even if it is the sunnah of the dawn prayer. So the ruling of nafil prayers is you don't need a specific intention to say it's the nafil, it's the sunnah, it's anything. If you just go up at Fajr time and you said 2 rakats, Allahu Akbar, and you were praying before Fajr, and then you went and prayed Fajr, 2 rakats fard. Those 2 rakats which you made no intention of sunnah count as sunnah. If you're praying Zohar time and you start your prayer and you say 4 rakats, Allahu Akbar, but you don't intend sunnah muakkada or sunnah of Zohar, those 4 rakats will count as sunnah of Zohar. So you don't need to make an intention for sunnah, whether they're the Fajr rakats or any other rakats. In ruling, they'll count, you'll pray them in the way that sunnah muakkada are prayed. So you'll pray with the tashahhud in the middle, and you'll get up and you'll make sure you read Fatiha with every surah, with every rakat, etc. You'll pray them as sunnah muakkada are prayed, but the intention is not required to say, these are sunnah muakkada and I'm praying them. Of course, if you did that intention, that's even better. You should make that intention, but it's not required to do so. It is perfectly fine just to say 2 rakats Allahu Akbar, and that counts as your 2 rakats of Fajr. And then you pray 2 rakats fard Fajr, then you have to mention the fard to get the Fajr rakats, the fard prayer, right? So that's how it works. So intention differs from a nafil prayer to a necessary prayer, a wajib and fard prayer. With the fard or the wajib on this side, you would have to say 3 rakats wajib or witr in your heart. You have to know it's wajib. Otherwise, 3 rakats Allahu Akbar doesn't count for witr, which is very unlikely. Practically speaking, you're going to know 100% I'm praying a wajib prayer. So that's what it requires. Knowledge of your intention is what is required, not pronunciation of it. So if you've never been saying wajib, 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 you've just been saying witr, witr, I'm praying for 3 rakats, witr, Allahu Akbar. That's fine, because in your heart, you know it's a wajib prayer, and that's what matters. It's not talking here about saying things, it's just about knowing. As long as you know these things, they're perfectly fine. Hopefully that answers your question, Hassan. So let's stop sharing this, or let's oh, here we go, that's it, stop sharing. So Bismillah, Hassan.
Bismillah. Where are we at? To stand in the obligatory prayers, though not for voluntary prayer.
Yeah, so moving on to the next point there.
Straightforward there. Are we going to go on to the next one? That one sounds straightforward, I think.
Yeah, so straightforward. Yeah. So again, I will make a point here though, is you have to stand for obligatory prayers. So for for voluntary prayers, you don't have to stand. That includes the sunnah as well then. Okay, so if you didn't stand for your sunnahs of Zohar or the sunnahs after Zohar, or so the muakkada, even if you didn't stand for them, they're still valid, and standing is not required in these prayers. However, in the sunnah prayers, you should stand. It's better to stand and more rewarding to stand, and disliked to sit down, but not invalid. Whereas in your fard prayers, if you sit down and pray without a reason, it's invalid. You must stand and pray in fard, in the wajib. In the sunnah prayers, which are like nafil, you don't have to stand, but it's disliked not to. It's valid not to stand. So you prayed your sunnahs before the prayer sitting down, and sunnahs after the prayer sitting down. It's actually valid. For nafil prayers, it's not disliked even to sit down. Okay, for nafil prayers, it's not even disliked to sit down. It's optional. So if you're praying 2 rakat nafil randomly at some point in the middle of the night, and you want to pray sitting down, there is no dislike or blemish in praying sitting down during nafil prayer. In the sunnah prayers, you can sit down as well. It's not going to be invalid, but it's disliked because the sunnah prayers are slightly more emphasized optional prayers than, the sunnah prayers. They don't really come under optional, they come under emphasized. If you don't follow them, you're really turning away from the Prophet ﷺ, which is a blemish, which is blameworthy. Hence, it is better to stand and pray the sunnah prayers. I hope that makes sense. Yep. So there is a difference between fard and nafil again here. But there is, like I said, the sunnahs are slightly different. So do remember that. And again, I'd point out here, for the sunnahs of Fajr, you need to stand as well. The sunnahs of Fajr are a slightly higher degree. If you look at the prayers, you have the fard prayers, you have the wajib prayers. So fard is like the 5 daily prayers. The wajib prayers, witr, Eid, and other prayers. And then the next category of prayer is the 2 sunnah of Fajr by itself. The 2 sunnah of Fajr are in between wajib and sunnah. So sunnah muakkada, which is emphasized sunnahs, and then you've got the wajib, witr, for instance. In between them is the 2 sunnahs of Fajr. They're somewhat like wajib, but they're not really wajib. They all come under sunnah, which come under the whole idea of nafil. but because they're so close to wajib or highly emphasized, and it's the best prayer. So what's the best prayer after the obligatory and wajib prayers? It's the two sunnah of Fajr. So for that reason, it's better to stand for that one, and it's better to make an intention for that one and treat it like a more important prayer, because it is more important in many ways. And something we might see later on as well in some of the rulings, they might point out that the Fajr prayer, the two sunnahs of Fajr, make sure you do this. Those two sunnah of Fajr are emphasized somewhat more than other prayers. Okay, that's the next one.
Okay, to recite at least one verse of the Quran in 2 rakahs of the obligatory prayer.
Okay, so now we move on to recitation. So what's the bare minimum? Again, this is not the required recitation. This is just telling you, let's just leave it at that. You need to recite Quran. Okay, how much Quran do I need to recite? We'll talk about later. It does say here, you need to recite at least one verse in 2 rakats of the obligatory prayer. What that means is, if you've got 2 rakats, which is Fajr, then every rakat needs some Quran. If you've got Maghrib 3 rakats, then 2 of the 3 need some Quran. If you've got Asr or Isha or Zohar, then 4 rakats, 2 of them need some recitation of the Quran. Okay, that's what it means, but that's not how it's practically done, and that's because we haven't got onto the further details of what actually needs to be recited in the prayer. But for now, take that as the bare minimum. And you could say, sort of apply this to a new Muslim. Somebody's a new Muslim learning how to recite the Quran. What's the bare minimum they need to do? That's the bare minimum. If they can do that, the Quran recitation is complete, and they can move on to the other parts of the prayer. Obviously, if you can recite the Quran, then there's more to be recited on top of that, which we'll talk about later. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so in the Fard prayers, 2 out of all the rakats must have recitation at least. It differs to the other prayers though. And how does that work, Hassan?
It is obligatory to recite Quran in all rakahs of voluntary prayer and in all the rakahs of the witr prayer.
Yep. So any other prayer, so if you take Fard out of the equation, you've got Nafil, you've got Sunnah, you've got Witr, all the other prayers, which we already kind of mentioned now, every single rakat requires recitation of the Quran. So there's actually, it's actually easier in the Fard. Well, if it's 4 rakat or 3 rakat, in Fajr it's still the same. But in the other prayers, or the Fard prayers like Asr and Isha, you don't have to pray, read the Quran in more than 2 rakats. You will do, like I said, that's different. The ruling's going to come later. It's sunnah to read in all the rakats. But the obligation is 2. In all other prayers, wajib, sunnah, fard, wajib, sunnah, nafil, wajib, sunnah, nafil, then praying the Fatiha, praying the Quran, so we're sticking to the Quran for now. We'll talk about the details later on, is required in every single rakat. So if you missed a rakat without Quran, or if you had a rakat without any Quran in it, it's invalid. And that wouldn't be considered to have prayed a rakat. So that's what it means here. So we're talking about the bare minimum, putting the prayer together slowly, as you can see. So we're not got to the full prayer yet. So don't think, oh, is that all you got to read? No, there's a lot more to come. Bear with us, inshallah. Bear with Imam Shurun Bulali. He's structured his book in a way where he builds an understanding of every component step by step. So the next part is?
There are no specific verses in the Quran that one must recite in order for the prayer to be valid.
Yeah, so what does that mean? It means that you can recite any of the Quran, فَقَرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنْهُ, and that was revealed for the prayer itself. Read what the Quran was easy for you. So somebody might say, I thought you got to read Surah Al-Fatiha, I thought you got to read a surah with Surah Al-Fatiha. What's going on here? That's coming. That is a wajib, that is something that's required, but not for validity, for completing your prayer, for making sure you pray the way the Prophet prayed and the way that you should pray. But if you didn't know Fatiha, for instance, and you just knew Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, that's what you learned first, then can you read that and your prayer valid? Yes. But if you know Fatiha, of course, you're going to read Surah Al-Fatiha. So it's basically just talking about validity of prayer. The bare minimum for a valid prayer, not a complete prayer, not the proper prayer, is just basically any Quran, right? And that's what it says there, right? So it's talking about that. If you're in congregation, life's a lot easier because the Imam covers your recitation, which is the next point. Hassan?
The person following the Imam in prayer must not recite Quran. Rather, he must listen and remain silent.
Yeah, so that's straightforward as well. It says the person following the Imam in prayer must not, so it's actually not allowed. It's not optional. I don't want to pray. I don't want to read the Quran, or I want to read the Quran behind the Imam. You should not read the Quran whilst following an Imam in prayer. Rather, you must remain silent and listen if it's a loud recitation, or remain attentive if it's a quiet recitation. And the recitation of the Imam covers the recitation of the follower. Okay, next point.
Okay. And if the follower behind the Imam does recite the Quran, it is prohibitively disliked because there is prohibition on the matter.
Yep. So now someone might say, okay, I want to read. You said don't have to read, but I want to read. What's the ruling on that? The ruling is it is prohibitively disliked. It's makruh tahriman, which means close to haram, wrong to do that, because that's not how the fard, or the congregational prayer, is performed. The congregation prayer is performed in a manner that is outlined by the hadith and the Quranic passages, and the understanding that you can kind of gather through the notes there. We're not going through the whole details, but you can read up yourselves and you can see is that whilst in prayer behind an Imam, it's actually wrong to read. You're supposed to listen and pay attention, and the Imam is leading your recitation. The Imam is presenting the prayer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on your behalf. So you don't have to get involved as well. You pray behind the Imam. His recitation is a recitation for you as well. Okay, moving on to the next part of the prayer, Hassan.
Okay, Sheikh. Just a quick one on that one, Sheikh. Will this cover shortly how much we should be praying behind the Imam, how much we shouldn't, in terms of when the namaz starts, ruku, sujood?
I'm not
Does
sure.
it cover that much later on?
I'm not sure the question.
So it's saying that it's saying here you shouldn't recite behind the Imam. When you're in behind the Imam,
yeah,
is the book going to cover how much you should read and then where to stop?
Okay, so you shouldn't recite the Quran. It says the Quran, right? I hope. Yes, it says, and the follower behind the Imam does not recite Quran. That's just the Quran. So the question is not about what other things you recite. We are going to talk about that as well. Yes, we're going to talk about you recite Thana, Subhanakallah. You recite the Takbirat. You recite the Shahud. That's different. When it comes to the Quran, it's only talking about the Quran right now. Then there's no recitation if you're behind the Imam. Yeah, it's going to talk about other things later on. Yeah.
Okay. It is obligatory to prostrate on something which the forehead can completely stabilize.
Yeah. So moving on to so there's one thing missing. It says what ruku', right? So ruku' is just ruku', full stop, and bowing, right? Bowing you have to do as part of the prayer, okay? And then it says what's sujood. So it has not mentioned the bowing in the English translation, which is just a word in itself, bowing. You have to bow basically. I already explained bowing is make sure your hands at least reach your knees in a bent forward position. Of course, the sunnah, we're going to talk about later, the details are coming on these elements, is to make sure your back is perpendicular with your legs, etc., and straight, and your head is not, folded down or, in a kind of bent down position. So we'll talk about that later. But sajda is mentioned, so you have to do sajda. But an additional point is mentioned regarding the prostration or sajda, which is that it has to be on something which your forehead, your forehead, which is used for prostration, has stability on. It can't. Meaning it finds what it says in the Arabic, istiqrar, which means like it's settled. It's not moving still. It's not sinking in still. Once it's settled and firm, settled istiqrar means to be settled and firm. In that situation, your sajda is valid. If you're praying on something like a cushion, like foam, like, I don't know, hay stacked, and you make your sajda, but what happens if you put more pressure on? If you put pressure on, you'll sink more and more in. That's not valid to make prostration on such a soft substance. That's what it's saying basically. As long as you make it on the floor, you make it on the carpet, the prayer mat, the carpet, wooden flooring, anywhere really, on the road, on the tarmac is fine. It's a solid substance. Your head is not going to sink in any further. But if you're praying, let's say, I don't know, maybe you're praying on a thick carpet or a mattress, not like you would, but imagine if you are, or you might have a cushion in front of you to prostrate on, that you need to press really hard to get to the bottom layer or the part where it's solid to make sure your prostration is a valid prostration, right? So make sure you prostrate in a solid way where there's stabilization and no further sinking is possible. Otherwise, your prostration or the place you're prostrating isn't really a valid place to prostrate. So adjust that and be careful regarding that, inshallah ta'ala. Hope that makes sense. Okay, the next point, Hassan.
Next one. Prostration is permitted on the palm of the hand and on the edge of his clothes, provided the place where the hand or clothes are placed is pure.
Yeah, so next point is the actual, where can you prostrate on then? Do you have to prostrate on the ground? Can you prostrate on a carpet? Can you prostrate on part of your garment? Do you know what is the ruling? And as long as your forehead touches something solid, even if it's the palm of your hand, yes, you can really put the palm out and prostrate on your palm, because your palm's solid. Obviously, your palm is going to be used for prostration as well, so one palm, not both of them, right? Otherwise, you'd probably fall on your face. You would be on your face, right? So if you were to put out the palm of the hand, or if you have the garment you could put there, and you would maybe to protect yourself from the ground, the mud, something that's on the ground, that's fine, as long as it's pure, as long as the substance, your hand is pure, which we should be, of course, and your garment is pure, whatever item you're using, you don't have to literally touch the actual soil or grass or sand on the ground. You just need to make sure you find that stability on whatever material is placed there. So a prayer mat is common, right? But even if it's your hand, as long as there's that stability, is perfectly valid to prostrate on such an item, or as long as it's pure, as long as the item is pure. So Bismillah, next point.
Prostration must be performed with the rigid part of the nose and the forehead, and it is not permissible to restrict the prostration to the nose only, unless there is a reason with respect to the forehead.
Yeah, so sajda now, so more detail on the sajda. You have to make sajda, well, actually it's additional part. So the fard element, now we've got to explain kind of fard and wajib, right? Is the forehead, okay? But the nose, which is what it talks about there, and not just the nose, the solid part of the nose, right? This bone of the nose, must also be included in sajda. So basically when you prostrate, it's this area here, forehead, and the upper bone here, wherever it starts or finishes, is what is required to be part of the prostration. If you restricted yourself to the forehead, your prayer is valid because you've done the bare minimum, but you missed the nose part, which is what it says there is wajib. So you can't miss out the forehead. You must do that. If you missed out the nose, then you've made a mistake, but it can be rectified. It should have been done. It's not the end of the prayer. It's not invalid. It's still valid. However, the other way around is if you just prostrate on the nose, right, and you don't actually put the head on the ground, the forehead on the ground, like this solid part here, that's invalid. That's not actually a valid form of praying, and that would be considered to not be a prostration, and therefore you haven't got the prayer. And you might think, who's going to do that? Who's going to prostrate on their nose? But somebody who's got injury on their head, they can do that. It says unless there is a reason with respect to the forehead. So you've cut yourself up. Obviously, you can't prostrate on a very ill forehead. There's maybe like a bruising that's really painful to touch on the ground, even with a slight amount of pressure. There could be a reason or two, illnesses. Then, of course, prostrating on the nose alone is the correct thing to do. Is the optional thing is the option you got to take, and therefore your prostration would be valid. However, without an excuse, I don't want to put my head on the floor, is not allowed. It's actually quite arrogant and rude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do that. Now, you might think nobody can do that. I've seen it. You might think, have you really seen that? Yes. But not because somebody was arrogant and didn't want to prostrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not in that case. It was a young lad, I would say probably 16, 17, maybe 18, I don't know, about that age. And we're in the masjid and he's praying next to me. And after, it wasn't during the prayer, it was after the prayer. I didn't notice anything during the prayer. I wasn't looking at him during the prayer, but after the prayer, we pray your sunnahs. You pray after. And during that time, I didn't notice him, obviously, prostrating and so forth. And when he was prostrating only on his nose. And he wasn't putting his forehead on the ground. And I started looking at him more in detail, like not like literally bending over, but I was like, is he really not prostrating on the ground? And I'm 100% sure he wasn't putting his forehead on the ground. I'm like, what's going on here? I didn't tell him anything. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't know what to say to him, to be honest. It's a long time ago, maybe like 20 years ago or something. Yeah. But I realized why he was doing it. Okay, and it might sound a bit funny or a bit silly as well. But remember, he's a young lad, and he's just thinking what's the best thing to do. So he had a nice hairstyle. He had this like gelled hair coming forward, like this fringe thing you do at the front, right? So basically, he didn't want that to be. It was all nice and gelled up, yeah. So he didn't want that to get messed up. He don't want to mess up his hair, basically, right? It sounds funny and a bit ridiculous, but he's a young lad. He was a genuine young lad. Right? He was to be in the masjid and praying was fantastic, mashallah, right? So he wasn't prostrating on his forehead; he's prostrating on his nose to avoid his hair style being ruined, right? So that is, precautionary measures for the coronavirus, maybe as well. If you're in the masjid and you think, wait a minute, there's what could be virus on this floor, and you don't put your forehead on, that's not valid because the nose is where the virus is going to come out. So the other way around is actually a question: could you leave the nose from prostrating if you fear a disease on the ground, and just use your forehead? I mean, I wouldn't pray in that place in the first place. If you're forced to, then yes, stick to the head and make sure your nose is away from the ground. But to be even that close to the ground might not be that effective. Allah knows best on that one, to be honest. But yeah, so there are a couple of questions here. I'll just check them out. It says, so it does not suffice to only put the tip of the nose on the floor. The bone needs to touch the floor as well. Yes, so that's a good point. The tip of the nose is not valid. This soft part is not valid. So when you prostrate and just the tip of the nose goes on the floor, you need to make sure the solid part, you don't need to press so hard you're hurting yourself. But you need to make sure your prostration is on the solid part, which isn't too far up, right? It differs from person to person, but it's not there. It's just up here. It doesn't have to be the bone, but just a solid part where it solidifies, right? That part needs to be touching the floor with your forehead. It says, is fear of catching the virus a valid excuse? I've just talked about that. I wouldn't recommend praying where you think there's a virus. But yes, if you do have to pray somewhere outside, it's prayer time's ending and you're going to pray, then pray without your nose on the floor. If you really fear that place you got your nose close to, like I said, if you're that close, I'm not a scientist or a doctor or specialist in contagious diseases or how germs are spread, but I would think that if you're that close to the floor, you've got a massive chance of breathing in anyway, whether your nose is touching the floor or not. So I would probably avoid praying until you find a safe spot, in my opinion. Life takes precedence over prayer. It's a legal ruling, right? We take that harm is avoided, or avoiding harm is preceded or is given precedence over attaining benefit. So making your prayers and fulfilling your obligations is important, and you should do that. But avoiding harm and threat to life and injury is also important. And in this case, is given precedence. That's the rule. So I would genuinely just play it safe and avoid that kind of thing, if that makes sense, inshallah ta'ala. Moving on to the next point, Hassan.
Okay. One must not raise the level of prostration higher than the level of the feet by more than half an arm's length. And if one increases over half an arm's length, then the prostration is invalid unless there is a crowd, in which case one may prostrate on the back of someone who is offering the same prayer.
Okay, thank you. So again, continuing more kind of rules of the prostration. The prostration has to be on the ground, as we said, and also on the same level as the feet. Okay, so normal circumstances, you're going to prostrate on the same level as the feet. What if where you're prostrating is a slightly raised platform? Maybe it's an incline on the earth, or maybe it's it has to be a very sharp incline, I suppose, but maybe it's a raised platform, there's a cushion there, it's a step there, and you found a place to pray where there's going to be a raised platform for your prostration. As long as it's not really high, that you're not really standing and prostrating, it's still on the ground. And it actually mentions here of half an arm's length, and it doesn't give a definition of half an arm's length, but roughly, very, very roughly, about a foot, right? About a foot is, an arm's length is differed over amongst the ulama. What does it mean by an arm's length? Some said 45 centimeters is an arm length, so that would be 22 centimeters, half an arm's length, which is less than a foot. Well, about a foot if you want to take it, at that level. But yeah, about a foot, 10 inches, let's say, right? 20 centimeters, something like that, 25 centimeters. If your prostration is higher than that, so basically your feet are here, and let's try and do the diagram as well. Okay, let's get to a new one. So this is, I'm going to try my best, guys. I apologize in advance. So this is ground level. Okay. In fact, let's make life a bit easier. So this is the ground. Sorry, it's already slightly bent, and somebody's praying. Like, I don't know how to do a prostration, person in prostration, but they're praying, right? And this is their arms, right? And that's their head, and that's the other arm, and that's a person. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, right? But that's a person prostrating on the ground. You can kind of figure it out, right? There's the hands, and there's the head. Okay, that's the normal kind of state of affairs. These would be the knees, somewhere like that, right? As you can see, I'm not an artist. Now that's normal, and that's actually, let's say that's slightly raised, right? That's the ground, let's say. So it would have been more like this, right? Like that. That's normal, and that's fine. Now what we're going to do is we're going to say that there was something here blocking the prostration, yeah? So it couldn't prostrate on the ground, normal. There was a step or something, yeah? So the person had to then raise their head and prostrate on higher ground. So their prostration now becomes more like this, right? And it's on here, right? That would be the head, that would be the arms, and that would be the other arm about here. But their head is on here now. That's the head, right? And that's the person's body is more like this, yeah? So the person is now prostrating on this raised platform. This raised platform, as long as it's approximately off the ground, this area here is about 20 centimeters or less. I'd say 25. Give yourself a bit more room. 25 centimeters or less is okay. Okay, right? If it is over here, so if it was about here, let's say, right, and that is 45 centimeters, let's say, and the prostration was on there, so the person is now prostrating on here, right, and that's their body, right, goes back down, right, then that's not allowed. That's invalid. Okay, so if you do have to prostrate on something slightly raised, slight, this one here, slightly higher than here is okay, is valid. Too high is not valid. So it says if it's more than half an arm's length, then it's invalid unless there is a crowd. So now, why would you even pray on a higher platform or level if there's a crowd and you have to now prostrate? And this happens, by the way. Where does it happen? May Allah allow us to visit the noble city of the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and his noble city and masjid. But I was in Hajj time. So last year in Hajj, alhamdulillah, we went on Hajj with some of yourselves. And I was in Riyadh al-Jannah. So we got into Riyadh al-Jannah. We were waiting, we were at the back, so we were just kind of there. We just at the back, sorry. We got into it afterwards. So we're waiting. And some of you know what it's like, and it's really crowded. And the police guys were saying, sit down. Make yourself. It's Isha time, so don't go between Maghrib and Isha. It's just chock-a-block, right? And that's what I did. So because there's two prayers together, people want to get in, and people get up, and it's always busy, but there tends to be prayer times tend to be obviously more busy, especially Maghrib between Isha. Everybody wants to stay between Maghrib and Isha in the masjid and worship, and then after Isha go back to the hotels and get food and stuff. That's the kind of pattern for the majority. So it's really busy, and basically it started to come to Isha time, and there was no space to pray. There was no space to do a sajda. There was hardly any space to sit. So people couldn't barely sit. So people were sitting on top of other people as well. So eventually it came to the prayer time. It was funny. So alhamdulillah, I got a spot where I could just get my head, and I was like literally going like sideways, trying to find a spot, trying to keep my face obviously buried to the Qibla as well, everything, just to get a spot and to prostrate with one hand, and like slightly to one hand, and you can't prostrate on your hand like we said. But some people were literally prostrating on other people, right? And one brother, he was literally, he was, I think it was two Egyptian brothers. One of them was prostrating, and the other guy was literally prostrating on his back. So you might think, when on earth are you going to prostrate on somebody? Well, when you're stuck in Riyadh al-Jannah, between Maghrib and Isha, and there's nowhere else to go, you can't leave, you can't go, you can't, it's prayer time. Can you pray behind on the back of someone? Yes. But with the condition, they're offering the same prayer as you. So a congregation is where you're going to get stuck, isn't it? I mean, if you're praying by yourself, I don't see a reason why you would get stuck, and you can't really pray on the back of someone. So in a congregation, if you're all stuck and it's not enough space, then as long as the person in front of you is prostrating on the ground, okay, and you're prostrating on his back. So obviously they knew each other, so I wouldn't just go prostrate randomly in the back of someone. That might upset them. But because they were friends, they'd been there together, and colleagues or whatever, or acquaintances, relatives, one was prostrating on the back of the other. It's fine. That can be done. That's a valid form of prostration if there's a necessity, and there was genuine necessity that we could hardly, any of us could hardly find a space to prostrate. So we were lucky to get a space, and we were kind of sharing it, so we knew, like, let's give everybody a chance to prostrate. And then we did get to Riyadh al-Jannah afterwards, alhamdulillah, prayed some rakats there after Isha, and then they closed it off for the ladies, so we didn't get much time there, but we did get in, alhamdulillah. So that's again some more rulings of the sajda. There's another ruling, if you 1 second, let me stop this again, I don't like this thing. Right, if you go back to here, if you can read on, Hassan, bismillah.
Next bit, one must place the hands and knees on the ground according to the most correct view. Additionally, part of the toes of the feet must be placed on the ground during prostration, and it's not sufficient to place the top surface of the foot on the ground during prostration. Yeah,
brilliant, mashallah. So again, more rulings on the sajda. How do we do sajda? It says, one must place the hands and knees on the ground according to the most correct view. So your knees must be on the ground for sajda. So when you're prostrating on the back of someone, you can't do it from a standing position. You can't prostrate on their back while standing. As long as your knees are on the floor, then you can prostrate on the back of someone. And of course, on the ground. We're just talking here about the knees need to be on the ground. And one must place the hands as well. Obviously, if you can't place the hands on the ground due to somebody in front of you, then the hands need to be on the back of that person as well as your forehead. But yeah, if the hands are not on the ground and knees are not on the ground, then it's not valid, okay? And the minimum is one of each, so one hand, one knee. In normal circumstances, so some people go into sajda, they don't put both hands on the floor. That's okay as long as one hand's on the floor. It's not okay, it's bad, but it's valid to just have one hand on the floor. Similarly, if you're prostrating on the floor normally and one knee is off, maybe due to an illness, which is a valid excuse, that's fine. You can leave one knee on the ground and it's a valid. If it's no excuse, it's still valid, but it's bad now, right? But one needs to be on the ground. And likewise, additionally, part of the toes of the feet must be placed on the ground. So the 7 places, or the 7 masajid, they're called, places of prostration, or the forehead, which we talked about the nose being a part of that as well. The 2 hands, the 2 knees, and the 2 feet. All 7 should be on the floor itself, touching the ground for a correct and full prostration. However, it's valid to just do the forehead, and if you leave the nose off, you've left a wajib, which we'll talk about what happens if you leave a wajib. It's not good, but you can leave a wajib, or you can't leave a wajib, but it's got its ruling basically. If you left one knee off the ground and one hand off the ground, then it still would be okay. And similarly with the foot, but you really should have all 7 parts through the forehead on the ground and the nose. And it's not sufficient to place the top surface of the foot on the ground. What that means is, so you have the sole of the foot, right? And you have the surface, the top of the foot. Right? So that you have the palm of the hand. That's like what goes on the floor, isn't it? The foot, the sole goes on the floor. And you have the top of the hand, the top of the foot, where your ankle is and the top of your foot is, and etc. Right? The ankle isn't on there, but it's on the sides, right? That's above. So what's on the bottom needs to be touching the floor. So if somebody prostrates like this, with their toes on the floor like that, brilliant. Some people prostrate like this. You might have seen it. They bend in their toes and they prostrate on the top of the foot, not on the bottom of the foot, not on the sole. What the author is saying here is that is incorrect and invalid, right? So he says, and it is not sufficient, it's not valid, not sufficient to place the top surface of the foot on the ground during prostration. So you must keep part of the toes on the ground for a valid prostration, i.e. the sole of the toes, and not merely the top surface, the nail of the toes or the top of the foot, and drag that on the ground. Simply drag like this, basically. No, have it like this. Have it like firmly like that. Don't have it when you fold up your toes and you're prostrating like this on the floor. Imagine this is your toes, right? That's invalid. However, that is what's mentioned here, and that is how it should be done. But due to a lack of learning and knowledge of the laws of prayer, I think many Muslims do this. Many Muslims pray like this. They don't put their feet out properly, their toes out, and they end up prostrating on they fold up their feet commonly. It's very common. So the ulama, the muftis, scholars, they've said that, look, you should pray like this, but if somebody has been praying like this, we're not going to say their prayer is invalid. We're not going to say that, you've never prayed properly, so start repeating your prayers. It's okay. Your foot was on the ground. So if no feet are on the ground, by the way, it's invalid. Just like if no knees are on the ground, which is going to be very tough. You can't really balance yourself on your feet and hands, right? So hands and knees will be on the ground. But if no feet are on the ground during prostration, like you lift your feet, some people lift their feet off the ground. That's completely invalid. There's no excuse for that. There's no leeway of saying it's forgiven. If your feet are not properly on the ground, okay, it's fine. They're on the ground some way or other. Your prayer is valid. But now start praying properly by putting your sole of your feet on the ground and put the toes on the bottom of the foot on the ground. And that's how it should be. But if you have no feet are on the ground at all, then that's invalid sajda. Sajda requires some part of one of the feet to be on the ground. So even if it's one toe of one foot, that actually suffices. And if that's not the case, then, when you're in sajda without anything on the ground, any feet on your ground, that's a bad thing to do, right? So it really needs to be something that we're aware of, inshallah ta'ala. Moving on to the next point. 1 second, Hassan. Go for it.
Okay, bowing must precede prostration.
I think that's straightforward. The next one.
To rise from prostration to a position close to sitting according to the correct position.
Correct position, a correct opinion. So when you go into sajda and you come out of sajda, you have to come, as it says here, close to sitting, to a position close to sitting. So basically somebody's doing sajda, right? Let's just imagine somebody doing sajda. I don't know how to do it like that. And they say, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la. That's not second sajda. To separate two sajdas, you have to sit up. So let's sit up. Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. That's what you got to do. Now, what's the minimum required of lifting, right? What's the minimum required? Closer to sitting. So if that's prostrating and that is sitting, that's what we call sitting. And the minimum, the closer to sitting is halfway. So more than 45 degrees. So let's do it again. Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. That's invalid. You haven't done a second sajda. That second sajda is not valid because you haven't come up closer to sitting. Let's do it again. Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Valid. Why? Because you came close to sitting and then you went back down. Okay? So you've got to basically separate your two sajdas with the sitting, right? And that's the sunnah and the wajib, etc. But if you were to just do that, invalid. And some people do that. I've seen people, and actually not very uncommon either, unfortunately. They'll do their fast prayer. Allahu Akbar. That's not how you pray. First of all, you don't rush the whole sajda. Second of all, you can't just go up like this and that. That's not valid. It needs to be, I would say, my kind of estimation, that's about 40, about there. That's about 45 degrees. So you need to be about there at least. Play it safe and then go back down. Of course, you should sit upright, pause, Allahu Akbar, and go in. We're going to talk about more details of the prayer. We're just talking about here the fact that you need to separate the two sajdas, otherwise it's not valid, is what's mentioned here, right? So now that you've gone up here, what must you do? You must come back down, right? And that's what it says next. So need the next. If you do the next 2 points, Hassan.
Okay. To return and perform the second prostration, and to perform the last sitting for the time equivalent to reading the tashahhud.
Yeah, and if you do the next one as well.
To delay the last sitting until one has completed all the pillars of prayer.
Yeah, brilliant. So, yeah, sorry, Hassan, you got anything to say?
Yeah, I was just going to read that last bit on that page.
Yeah, we'll read that one.
Okay.
Read that one. We'll do these first three. So going back, obviously, to the prostration. Obviously, prostration is fard. So going back to the prostration is fard. Obviously, it's the obvious point. We don't need to go into that too much. Although it does give you a reason for that, etc. And the next thing mentioned is as an obligatory part of the prayer. Remember, this first section was just the pillars of the prayer. It wasn't the prayer, every single thing. What do you do? What do you say? It's coming up. We're going to talk about the Subhanakallah wa bihamdika. We're going to talk about Bismillah, talk about Fatiha, talk about... This is just the conditions, the absolute minimum and the pillars of the prayer. So one of the pillars of the prayer is to sit at the end of the prayer. So the Qu'ud al-Akhir, the last sitting, is called Qu'ud al-Akhir. To sit for that time is an absolute must and part of the prayer. If you don't sit at the end of a prayer, you can't finish your prayer and it's invalid. Okay, so you must sit, and of course you recite tashahhud, at-tahiyyatu lillahi wa salat, you recite salawat and Prophet sallallahu Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin, you recite a dua, you do salam. That's coming later because they're on the wajibat. The absolute pillar of the prayer to finish the prayer is to sit and do certain things, but sitting for the time being is what's mentioned. And the next point that was mentioned is it's only a last sitting if it's actually the last thing. Or it's the last part of the arkan, the last part of all the obligatory actions, all the pillars of the prayer. So the final pillar, there's other things you do at the end of the prayer, but the final pillar is the last sitting. So it can't be called the last sitting if it's not the last thing, the last pillar. So you can't do a sajda after this. You can't go and recite Quran after this. You have to do this as the last thing, and then you conclude your prayer with tashahhud, with the salawat, durood sharif, and with dua and with salam. That must be the case. You can't do a sajda after this, because sometimes you do a sajda after this for messing up the prayer or forgetfulness. Then you have to repeat the tashahhud to make it the last thing that you've done in the prayer. That's the ruling of the final sitting. It has to be the last thing to be a valid final sitting, and then you can give salam after this. Okay, hope that makes sense. Next point, Hassan. Hassan, are you with us? Hassan's had to step out, I think. So the next point was to perform the pillars while one is conscious. So obviously, you're not going to pray when you're in a coma or you're unconscious, but you can fall asleep during prayer. So if you fall asleep during part of the prayer, it's not an invalid prayer. It's just when you wake up, you've got to carry on from that point. Right? So when the prayer time, when you're praying the prayer, then make sure you're awake, basically. If you fall asleep, which can happen in prayer, then just make sure you make that part of the prayer up, or you may actually do it because you were asleep. I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is sajda. If you fall asleep in sajda, it's not a sajda until you're awake in sajda. I don't think you can fall asleep while it's reciting the Quran or any other part, right? Otherwise you just stop. In sajda, you can stop in sajda, but is that a valid sajda? Well, not unless you're awake. So if you wake up in sajda and spend time in sajda awake, then you can carry on with the prayer. But if you don't perform it in a wakeful state, then, I mean, you can sleepwalk. I don't know if you can sleepwalk in prayer, but that's a very rare circumstance. But it's a ruling that you need to be conscious of your mind has to be awake and conscious. No, not attentiveness here, just actually like awake, conscious. Awake, let's say, you have to be awake. And that would then be a valid prayer. If not, you just, I don't know, you're sleepwalking, which is amazing. You're praying in your sleep, which is very good, but it's not valid prayers. It doesn't fulfill your obligations. I think Hassan's back, so if you want to carry on, Hassan.
It is conditional to either have full knowledge of the nature of the prayers and all its obligatory features, to know this in a manner that allows one to differentiate it from the sunnah characteristics. Further down, one may believe that all the prayers he performs are obligatory, and all of this is so that one does not offer optional prayers instead of an obligatory one.
Yep, thank you, Hassan. What that means is the translation may throw you off a little bit, but the explanation is given there itself. So the wording mentioned and the translation and then the explanation given with it really gets to one main point, is you just got to know that you're praying a fard prayer when you're praying a fard prayer. That's it. Doesn't matter what features or this, that, the other. You just got to know there's something called a fard prayer, something called a wajib prayer, and something called a nafil or sunnah prayer. When you do a nafil and sunnah, it doesn't matter if you know or not. We've talked about that. But when you're doing a wajib prayer or a fard prayer, you got to make sure you're doing a fard prayer. That's what you got to know. I'm doing a fard prayer. If you know that, that's it. You don't need to know that in fard there's this, in sunnahs there's that, in nafils there's this. No, you have to know the prayer I'm praying, these 4 rakat I'm doing, I'm praying them as an obligation, as a fard to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's enough. And that counts as a fard prayer. If you don't know that, which is, like I said, not really going to be common, but if you don't know that, you don't know actually, what prayer am I praying? I'm praying sunnah, I'm praying fard, I don't know, I'm just praying prayer. In that case, then yes, your prayer wouldn't be valid. It'd be a nafil prayer. So the bare minimum is nafil, you get nafil. So that's what it says at the end, that this is, all of this is so one does not offer an optional prayer instead of an obligatory one, i.e. in place of an obligatory one. So you think you're praying an obligatory one, but you didn't know what to say or do or think or intend, and you're just praying 4 rakats, but that's going to count as nafil. So you don't want to go and try and pray your fard prayers, but end up praying nafil. Very unlikely that happens, but it's a point mentioned here. So we take heed of the fact that we need to know that's fard prayers, wajib prayers, and nafil, sunnah, stroke, nafil prayers. So we will stop there. It now moves on to the arkan of salah, the shara'it of salah, which is still going to go into more detail of what I just discussed. So some of the things I've discussed will be repeated here, which is good. I intended that because repetition is a way of learning. So we'll talk about the aura again, we'll talk about the sajda again in different ways. We will talk about these things again, some of them, and we'll go into some detail about covering oneself. So it says here, conditions of prayer, purity. We're not going to talk about that too much, but there's a few things mentioned. What is connected to the aura? So again, covering the aura is mentioned. A few things about that. What if you do if you can't cover yourself? That kind of ruling. Some quite graphical stuff, but we'll go through it. Then qibla, what happens if you can't face the qibla? You don't have the qibla. We mentioned that is coming. So these are again repeating the conditions of prayer, but then going into further details and scenarios. There's some scenarios that the Imam Shuru Mulali brings up. So before we finish, we'll just go over some of the questions I think some of you have sent in. Right, so when Imam leads prayer, they say takbir while standing, not in ruku or in sujood. Yeah, so the takbir we're talking about was only the takbir of commencing the prayer. That's the takbir that everyone, the Imam and everyone else, has to stay in a standing place, the tahrima, the one that initiates the prayer. Every other takbir is sunnah and it can be said in any position really, wherever you are, it can be mentioned, right? As a reminder, everyone, to log into the class is by password. You can enter straight away. You don't need to wait to be allowed into the class. In the message that was sent out, there was a password. There was a meeting ID and a meeting password. Just put those 2 things in and you can enter straight into the meeting, inshallah ta'ala. Some of you did that, jazakumullah khairan. Those of you who didn't know that, that's a reminder for next time, inshallah. So when the Imam leads the prayer, they only say the takbir while standing, not in ruku or sujood. Yeah, they only say the first takbir standing. And in fact, no, they say several takbir standing, but the ruling is that the takbir that you have to do to start the prayer must be standing. If they did the takbir of the ruku in ruku, it's fine. It's not fine, it's okay. So the Imam goes into ruku, says Allahu Akbar down there, is fine. But you can say Allahu Akbar standing and going to ruku, which is better, right? Which is better. The time for the takbir for each one we'll go through. That's in the congregational prayer section, inshallah ta'ala. The next question is there a difference between male and female prostration position? Yes, there is. Again, that's going to come later. There is a difference between the way that ladies place their hands, the way they do ruku, the way they do sujood from men, and the general prayer. We're going to talk about that within the prayer itself, inshallah, when we come to that section. So yes, the answer is yes. Can you change the intention of prayer after starting the prayer? Let's say you have the intention of praying Zohar, but it's actually time for Asr and you find out after that you've started the prayer. What do you do from there? No, you can't change the intention of a prayer once you start the prayer. So if you started praying Zohar, but you actually was trying to pray Asr, then you start again. And that's happened to me as well. I actually prayed, I was actually the Imam as well in this occasion. And I prayed Maghrib, but luckily it was Isha time. Right, so I prayed Maghrib twice. I prayed Maghrib when I literally came from the masjid and prayed Maghrib. Went to somebody's house, we were doing classes and stuff. Then at the end, we prayed Isha together and I led. And I prayed Maghrib again. I was like, yes, Maghrib time, Allahu Akbar. And I did Salam I sat after 3 rakats and I could feel that something's wrong. But I just totally oblivious that it was Isha, not Maghrib. And then I gave Salam after 3 rakats and he goes, what have you done? You've prayed Maghrib, 3 rakats, you forgot a rakat. I goes, no, it's Maghrib, isn't it? He goes, no, it's Isha. I was like, oh, oops, I thought it was Maghrib still, right? We had just prayed Maghrib from the masjid, but sometimes you forget. So if you start a prayer and it's the wrong prayer, then you've got to start again. You can pray 2 rakats and get nafil reward. So what would you do if you realized halfway through? Pray 2 rakats, it'll count as nafil, and then start again and pray your Asr, pray your Zohar, whatever prayer is. So no, you can't change the intention during a prayer. Once you start with an intention, that's the intention for that prayer from there on. It can't be changed, and that's the ruling on intentions in prayer. And we'll stop there. Walhamdulillah.